Welcome to the MS Dev Show, episode number 187. This week we talk with Clayton Hunt and John Callaway about practical test-driven development, why you shouldn't use a GET request for your garage door, and we talk about everything from Gherkin Syntax to Zombocom.
Welcome to Zombocom. This is Zombocom.
Raygun gives you complete visibility on errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. Replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files or having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window into how users are really experiencing your software applications. Check it out today at raygun.com.
This week we have John Callaway, a Microsoft MVP, focusing primarily on web technologies and has experience with everything from PHP to C# to React.js to SignalR. Clean code and professionalism are particularly important to him, as well as mentoring and teaching others what he has learned along the way. And we also have Clayton Hunt, and he focuses on software craftsmanship and is a signatory of both the Agile Manifesto and the Software Craftsmanship Manifesto. He believes that through short iterations and careful gathering of requirements that we can deliver the highest quality and the most value in the shortest time. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm. And Carl, what do we have for the comment of the week?
This week, the comment of the week came to us off of Twitter. It's Sung Kim. And he said, great introduction to Docker and Kubernetes on the MS Dev Show with Rita Zhang. He wasn't sure where Kubernetes fit in, but Rita explained it in very simple terms and made the concepts easier to understand.
Yep. Yeah, you know, that's what's really cool about the show is, like, if we can, and whenever we get these comments, like, just even with one person, like, they just didn't understand how these things worked and what the relationship was, and they listened to the episode and now they do. That is so cool. I mean, that's really cool thinking about, you know, all of the people that we've sort of pushed forward and are going to build. You know, this guy's going to go on to build something like really cool that, you know, we're going to end up using in our lives.
Yeah, and if you want to get mentioned on the show like Sung, send an email to feedback@msdevshow.com, comment on Facebook, YouTube, or Stitcher. And we especially love those 5-star iTunes reviews.
Yes, we do. Okay, so let's jump into the news. So the first one here, hard drive stats for Q1 2018. So this is from Backblaze, who I actually use. And every quarter they put out these stats. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to call out here, Carl.
So do you want to just mention what Backblaze does so we get a little bit more context?
Yeah, well, they do a couple things, but one of the you know, kind of the core of what they do is they figured out how to make storage basically as low overhead as possible. So they made it dirt cheap from their standpoint, cramming as many hard drives into a server as they possibly could. And then they offer unlimited storage for, I think it's like $5 or $6 a month. Or you can pay it like on an annual basis. And I'm backing up, I think 3 terabytes of data now, 2 or 3 terabytes of data with them. So basically it's a backup service. And they actually, like, their whole interface it's very well done because they try not to take up like your entire upload, and they will like throttle it back if you're using your upload and things like that. So they just do a great job doing backup. So they obviously have a ton of hard drives.
Yeah, so needless to say, they're hard drive experts.
Yes.
And they obviously monitor their hard drives, which comes to this blog post article, which I think is really interesting, kind of like for 2 aspects. One, like when you look at all of the hard drives together, it's like a 1.2% annual failure rate.
Yep.
Which is just showing like hard drives are becoming just more and more just robust throughout the years. Mm-hmm. I know when we worked together in a previous company, we would get hard drives in and run SpinRite on them, and I think there was something like a 20 or 30% failout rate just from running SpinRite on them for a day.
Yeah,
and seeing that these have a 1% failout rate for a year, that's quite a bit of improvement.
Yeah, and we actually, that's actually kind of an interesting backstory too, because we were using SSDs, and we were using the SSDs that had that bug that after a certain amount of runtime would just like shut down, and that was causing some issues. But yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, it's a really low percentage. I mean, what I always get out of this is, you know, if you look at this, I actually stopped buying Seagate drives because they had these 4 terabyte Seagate drives where they were having, well, here it says 2.3 failure rate. I think they had a higher historical fail. Actually, if I go back, here we go. So from the whole period, they actually had some Western Digitals with a 10% failure rate. And then they had some Seagates. I'm not seeing the Seagate, but in any case, I had looked at their data and said, when I'm not touching Seagates, which is kind of funny because the Seagates now are actually getting super reliable. Like if you look at their 10 terabyte drives, they have 1,220, and they've had 0 drive failures. And also based on their previous numbers, their HGST drives were super reliable. I think I have the 4 terabyte ones. They have 15,000 of those, and they've had 16 failures. So they are at a 0.43% annualized failure rate. So, I mean, these hard drive manufacturers need to like take notice, because people like me are purchasing drives based on this data. Because I don't, I am using it in a storage basis array, so I can tolerate some failure. But I certainly don't want failure, because it's not fun, because then I got to buy another one.
Yeah, and the other thing that I really wanted to mention is, like, going back year to year, it's not always the same companies that are doing better or worse.
Yep.
They kind of just seem to like rotate through. So it's not like, well, Seagate sucked this year, I'm not going to buy them forever. You do kind of have to like look at what they're currently doing, because they're constantly improving. Yeah,
don't hold a grudge. Like Seagate 10 terabyte drives, failure rate 0.47. 12 terabyte drives, 1.09. Like there's a big difference there. Man, Western Digital is just terrible. They used to be good too, or at least maybe I just thought they were good. I don't know. Toshiba, let's see here. HGST. From what I've seen here, I mean they are just they never have like the best model, but they always seem to be overall mostly reliable. But again, don't hold a grudge, and don't also assume that they're not going to make a whole bunch of bad drives for a while. So just keep monitoring this every time they release it. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And then the next story here, this is why GET requests should be idempotent.
Yeah, there's a guy put on Twitter a story. I'm just going to read it really quick because it's not too long. It says, you know how HTTP GET requests are meant to be idempotent? Well, I have a story for you. A while back, I added a Wi-Fi control to our garage doors with these Wemos D1s. The Wemos expose a web page with a link that says toggle. The endpoint for the link activates a relay, which is hooked up to the push button on the garage door, which makes the door go up and down. The toggle endpoint responds to GET requests. I threw the code together in minutes and was too lazy to spend another couple minutes figuring out post. #regret. Safari finally figured out I was using toggle page regularly, so I added it to my favorites, which are iCloud synced between all of my devices. So every time I opened a new tab on my laptop, desktop, iPhone, iPad, the garage door opened or closed. Late at night, early in the morning, or randomly throughout the day. This, kids, is why GET requests should be idempotent.
Yeah, at first I was like, why do they have a toggle? Like, it was funny, I was kind of hung up on that, but then I realized that it's because the garage door button is, the button's already a toggle, so like it is what it is already. And I hate
that way they don't have to have sensors for state.
Yeah, exactly. So it really reminds me of like my remote. Like I have a Logitech Harmony remote, and my TV has it actually has IR commands for on and off, and my stereo only has a toggle for the power. So anytime anything gets screwed up, of course, it's the stereo being in the wrong state. So like toggle is just, I would say, evil by itself. But yeah, if you are going to be modifying state through a GET request, then that's evil as well. Anything else we want to say on that? I just thought that was kind of amusing, and that's something that hopefully will remind people that that's not a good way to use that. Perfect. Well, let's get to our guests, because we're going to be talking about unit testing, and I think this is kind of an interesting topic, because this is something that I started unit testing back in. I don't even know. Like I'm curious, like when it kind of first came to .NET, because I was using NUnit back in, I want to say like 2003. Maybe even 2002. So, kind of shortly after .NET itself came out. So I guess the first thing, guys, that I wanted to ask and kind of understand, kind of overall is like, what is the state of testing these days? Like, is it a lot different than it was back in, 2003, whenever I was doing it?
Well, I came to testing fairly late in my career. I spent many, many years ignoring it, avoiding it, and really just not understanding the point, not understanding the process. So I've only been really involved heavily in unit testing maybe 5 or 6 years now. And since then, I would say that the premise hasn't changed, but the tooling and the documentation has improved significantly, and it seems like it's becoming a little bit more pervasive through the industry. I've worked a couple of different jobs, a couple of different projects where unit testing and test-driven development were just the way development was done. And that's certainly a difference from just a few years ago.
Yeah, that seems like a huge difference. I mean, I remember it would have been probably in the 2008, 2009 timeframe. I was at a job where I was trying to convince my boss that unit testing was a good idea, which in hindsight was the worst thing that I could be doing. And not the unit testing itself. I can explain that. But anyway, like from his perspective, he's like, no, like this, don't do this. This is terrible. Like, I don't want you spending time on this. So it's great. And we can kind of dive into like why that was the completely wrong approach. But, that's great to hear that like actually some teams now as some employers are, you can kind of come in and actually be among friends.
So what's your overall approach to unit testing? What does that look like?
We typically go with a more of a BDD style approach. So we try to get the requirements from the business, whether it's a business analyst or a product owner. And then once we have those, we base the testing off of what the user needs. At some point, we will do what I typically refer to as developer tests, where I know that this method needs to do this thing in this circumstance, but we try to focus on what the user needs. That way, focusing on that higher level allows for the system to be a bit more flexible. You can refactor the system and not have to change your tests because the overall premise of the test that you wrote isn't changing, just the code that's supporting it.
So what does that look like in code? Like, do you have separate, business unit tests and, function unit tests? How is that organized or laid out? How do we, figure out how to know when to do which when?
I don't generally separate them. I will keep the tests that are directly related to the methods in a class, like specifically for that class. I will keep them in a folder generally named after the class in my test project. And then the business tests are either in a folder surrounding that, or I have experimented with having a set of specifically business cases in their own folders. So like maybe a context folder. So that'd be like your given. So given a new user, and then that folder might have stuff that will help set up a user and maybe tests around what a new user is. And then inside that folder, dig deeper and have other context-based stuff that might be supported by having a new user. And then in another folder outside of the given folder, maybe have some kind of condition. Are you guys familiar with the Gherkin syntax, given, when, then?
No.
Okay, so the way that I try to convince my business analysts and product owners to provide acceptance criteria is in the form of a given, when, then statement. Mm-hmm. So given a logged on user, when purchasing an item, then, well, they're hard to come up with on the spot. But it's basically you have the given, which represents the context of the test or of the requirement, really. The when, which is the action that the user is taking, and the then, which is the result that's expected when that action is taken in that context.
All right, so I'm looking this up on behat.org, and they've got some Gherkin syntax. I like one. They've got one for coffee. It says feature serve coffee. Scenario, buy last coffee. Given that there are one coffee left in the machine and I have deposited $1, when I press the coffee button, then I should be served a coffee.
Right. And that's exactly the kind of test that I would prefer, or the kind of requirement that I would prefer to write my test against. If you can get the business to deliver requirements in that fashion. So I normally have a user story, your typical as a role, I want feature, so that reason. And then that is supported by a few of the Gherkin statements, scenarios with given when ends. The code and the unit test almost write themselves.
That's really interesting. So yeah, this is, I've heard about this, doing unit tests like this, or doing tests like this. I guess we're calling them like business tests or whatever we want to call them. But this is kind of interesting because like back when I was doing, I was a huge proponent of unit testing. And from my perspective, it was always like, here is the investment that I'm making in unit tests, and here's the payback. And from my perspective, it was always like the lower level functions that I could test. They had like this massive payback. And actually the first time that I really used unit testing was I had this. I was converting an application from VB6 over to .NET, and there was a function in there that somebody had written that would take in a string, and that string would say like now minus 5 days, and it had to convert that into what does that actually mean? What is the actual timestamp that corresponds to? And it's kind of interesting because I first converted it over and then I started writing these unit tests, and then I realized that the original code that I was converting actually had tons and tons of bugs in it that I found. I found all the edge cases that it didn't support. And then I was able to test all these different permutations and modify my code. And eventually, like I was pretty confident that it was hardened. And I would say overall, like there was less development time. The whole ROI that I got from that was insanely high. And that's when I really started talking to other people like, hey guys, like this is significant. If you do this, you can develop things faster, and your code will be so much better. So this is interesting that you guys kind of, take it from the other side of this. I mean, do you see as big of a return on investment when you're writing this type of test?
I feel like we do, because it focuses in on specifically what it is that the business wants. So, and we don't get me wrong, we do write the tests that you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Those are what I call developer tests. Like the developer has an algorithm and they know that it needs to behave in a certain way, but there's no actual supporting business requirements to deliver the algorithm. So the developer writes the test to fit the algorithm. But writing the test based off of the Gherkin scenarios, I feel allows the developer to focus in on the big picture that the business cares about and deliver that business value as fast as possible, because we're not worried about all the little details unless the business is. We're just, if I meet these scenarios, then I know that the business will be happy. And certainly you want to look for edge cases, and you want to consider what could go wrong. And I would even say discuss that with the business and inform them of those things. And then they can do their cost benefit analysis, and hopefully they decide that they want to cover those edge cases. But it's possible, depending on the market situation, that they may want to just write those down as things to do in the future and skip them for now. Yeah.
But it seems like, let's take this coffee example where we're buying the last coffee here. Like at the low levels, it's funny because like I've seen so many different vulnerabilities come out in various pieces of software, or you're calling an API or there's like this whole Facebook fiasco where it's like, if you were a developer, like the second you look at that API, you realize that you have like access to everything, which seems pretty crazy, so like at a certain level, it seems you sort of have this insight into vulnerabilities. And when you're at a certain level of code, so in this case, you're working with money, for example, and there's probably a lot of functions in there where, if you end up with certain dollar amounts or things like that, you could, get free coffee, or manipulate the machine in some way. I mean, imagine if this was like a voting machine, if your voting machine spec, and I'm just trying to understand kind of your approach here, but if I was writing a spec for a voting machine, right, I would say, given, I don't know, I'm not good at writing these things, but basically when I vote for this person, like the vote tally goes up, right? And if I deliver that, there are voting machines out there that are written like that, but people have found that there's different ways to hack them. And it's not like, write a spec for, make this, when person attempts to hack machine, don't allow it. Right. So like, am I totally off base here? Like what is your thinking around that?
Well, I feel like, so certainly it might be a difficult thing to write, but if the program is capable of detecting that someone is trying to hack the voting machine, right? Like if it's something that you can program a fix for, then there's probably a way to write the requirement. And that may not be a requirement written by the business person because they may not understand that. That might be where some of the communication in Agile comes in, where the developer goes, all right, I've been paying attention to security concerns, and I know that this system can be hacked in this way. So we need a spec specifically for this situation to prevent bad things from happening. But also, it could just be that part of the developer's algorithm for achieving the overall goal of incrementing the vote includes the ability to prevent hacks.
Yeah.
And that's when the developer tests come in. Like, all the business asked for was that when somebody votes, the vote count goes up.
Yeah.
But the developer knows there's a security concern, so as part of their algorithm for making the vote count go up, they are also covering this edge case, and you would write a test for it. Those tests are more specific to the implementation, whereas the business tests, because the business, they care about results, not necessarily about how it happens.
Yeah.
Whereas the developers, we care about how it happens because we care about those security concerns and whatnot. So we write the developer tests to make sure that everything is happening in a good way, and we write the business tests in order to make sure that we are achieving the business goals.
Okay.
So if the anti-hack is a business goal, then there should probably be a business story or use case for it. But it's not always a business goal. It could just be part of being a good developer.
Okay, because that's kind of what I was getting at. Let me kind of repeat this back to you, because this is kind of what's in my head, and I think you've explained it pretty well. But so let's say I'm writing this function that says, I have two methods in a class, and I have record vote, and then I have another one which says, void vote, right? Like I want to cancel. Let's keep it simple, and we'll say cancel vote. And, my first pass at that cancel vote, I could just say vote minus, which would be horrible. But, that's one of the reasons why we're writing unit tests, right? Like from my perspective, I would want to write a unit test that says hey, if the vote count is 0 and I say cancel vote, it should stay 0. Whereas, if that code is written poorly, maybe it loops around and all of a sudden somebody has 16 million votes. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you would put both into place, right? You'd have a developer unit test that covers that situation. It really covers all those edge situations for that particular piece of code. And then you would also have the business specifications that ensure that the high level functionality is working as intended. Did I get that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, the situations are not normally quite that straightforward, right? So
right.
You may write the code in kind of a naive way to meet the business requirements, and then 2 days after it's in production, somebody realizes there's an issue. Well, the issue doesn't mean that the business requirements were wrong. It just means that you need extra edge case requirements, or at least tests, to prevent whatever the issue was from happening. So you can extend the testing system by adding in those tests that will reproduce and prove that the issue is no longer there, and the business use case should still pass because it's at a higher level.
Okay, that's great. That's a great point.
Yeah, and I work with a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and clients where they don't always have the time or resources to hire a BA or to do proper requirements gathering. So oftentimes my requirements start with we need to be able to record votes. Oh, okay, let's record a vote. We also need to be able to validate that as a second thought, maybe a day later. Oh yeah, we shouldn't record a vote if it's not valid. And what does not valid mean? And so those requirements kind of grow and become more complex as we digest them, as we understand them, as we work with the business. And therefore our test suite becomes more comprehensive. And then our application grows to satisfy all those test cases that we put in.
Very cool. Thank you. One thing we didn't mention was kind of how you guys ended up here. And you guys have actually written an entire book on this. So, this podcast will be like 1% of 1% of what's actually in that book. So I am curious, like, overall, I mean, it's a pretty large book. So, you want to give me kind of a summary of what is covered in the book?
Sure. The book is titled Practical Test-Driven Development Using C#7 subtitle JavaScript. The about half of the book is devoted to C# and the other half to JavaScript with examples in React. Because we're both web developers by trade, and these days you have to know some kind of JavaScript framework if you're doing any web development at all. And so we took a real world example project and kind of went end to end with it throughout the book, and really kind of made it so that anyone can pick up with either some background in C# or some background in JavaScript and not feel lost along the way.
Okay.
So is there, it's interesting that you're covering both C# and JavaScript examples. I know it's been a while since I've done, kind of full end web development and unit testing in each, but how big of a difference is unit testing in C# versus JavaScript? I
would say they're similar. Of course, there are semicolons in each language. The tooling is obviously a little bit different. Everybody has their own preferred IDE and whatever plugins that they might use. If I'm doing C# development, I'll be using Visual Studio 2017 with nCrunch so that I can continually run my unit test suite. If I'm doing web development with React, then I'll use WebStorm and then just run my test suite in Jest. I know Clayton has some other tools and preferences.
Yeah, even though the book is using React, for work purposes, I'm doing Angular. And for Angular, we're just using VS Code with Karma as a test runner and Jasmine as the testing library.
Okay.
Pretty much all of the JavaScript testing libraries have basically the same interface. It's a very behavior-driven development interface for testing. It's always describe, some feature, it, and then the it is kind of the start of your test. So this feature does something is basically what you're saying.
Yeah, and we both have some experience introducing test-driven development to our respective teams. So we both kind of start with tests to help somebody get going and get familiar with the whole process. So we might test that a class exists, or we might test that a method exists. Then we might tie the first several tests directly to the implementation of the code that we're trying to write. But as we progress and as the people that we're working with are progressing and understanding a little bit more, that's when we start to introduce the behavior-driven naming conventions and testing style, so that we're really focusing on ensuring that the behavior of the system is correct, not that the function or method is doing the implementation.
I think that's pretty interesting. I've never, I've done unit testing in the past, but I've never tested if like a class or a method exists. I've always assumed that it exists as part of it. I guess how as a learning step, since I've never thought to doing that, like how important is it to even like kind of do something like that as you're learning on adding this new tool to your belt?
It seems to really help the developers that are brand new to testing. A lot of times when you're trying to write tests for the first time, the big stumbling block is, well, what kind of test do I write? And when you can't think of any kind of test to write, you write the test that's going to make you write the code that you want to write. And typically the first code that you want to write is a new class or a new method. So simply asserting that method exists or that class exists is a pretty good jump start to getting somebody into testing. But as you said, it's certainly not needed. And if it wasn't for the fact that most teams are constantly bringing new people on or replacing people, you could probably transition off of doing that. But I do find that with the constant changing of employees and developers, that continuing to make it a practice to do those it exists tests really helps with transitions.
I see. So it's more of a learning tool for somebody who just has no experience with testing. That's a pretty cool way to think about it.
Yeah, because if you've anytime you start something new, there's a certain level of anxiety. We're paid to be the ones that know the answers. We're paid to be the ones that know how to do the implementation. So if we're introducing test-driven development to someone that has no experience with it, it can be, kind of nerve-wracking. So we want to show them success early on. And that can be as simple as you've written a test to check that this class exists. It doesn't yet. Now you implement or create that class. Now it does exist. Now your test is passing. You've just written your first successful unit test.
Ship it.
Pretty much.
Raygun provides full-stack error, crash, and performance monitoring for tech teams. Whether you're a software engineer looking to diagnose and resolve issues with greater speed and accuracy, a product manager drowning in bug reports, or you're just concerned you're losing customers to poor quality online experiences, Raygun can provide you with the answers. Get full-stack error and performance monitoring in one place. The next time you're struggling to replicate errors and performance issues in your codebase, think Raygun. Head over to raygun.com. Get up and running within minutes and dramatically improve the online experiences of your users.
I have to listen. I listen to Accidental Tech podcast occasionally, and Marco Arment on it. He's the author of Overcast, and that's the podcast listener that I use. And on the podcast, on his this is confusing now because he's a podcaster who writes a podcast app. But in the podcast app that he writes, and he's very vocal about not writing any tests whatsoever. And they're always trying to convince him that he should be doing unit testing. And he does have some bugs. I mean, it crashes in some edge cases, but for the most part, it's pretty reliable. Is there some way that we can convince him that he should be testing without, sounding like a jerk?
Oh, well, that's kind of a fun one. And to be clear, testing does not mean that you won't have bugs. You can only test the things that you can think about to plan for. And since we're not perfect, we're going to miss some stuff. But as far as my belief on writing unit tests, one, I believe they should be written before the code. And that's more of a thing where if you don't write them before the code, you will be less inclined to cover all of the use cases after you've written the code. But the second one is that if you're not testing your code automatically, then you have to be testing it manually, or potentially in his case, everyone that uses his code is testing it manually. So I prefer automatic testing because I'm lazy. Maybe he's not as lazy as I am.
Yeah, and TDD is a personal discipline. So, the fact that Clayton and I both find it extremely useful and helpful is really just because we've spent the time to practice and to become accustomed to it and have become much more. We've become quicker developers as a result and feel that we're delivering higher quality code than without it. So if he's not had the same experience, then there's really no reason for him to change. With that said, there are certain benefits to having a comprehensive suite of unit tests. Introducing regression bugs is severely limited as a result if you have a fairly comprehensive suite of unit tests. And when you're doing some refactoring, you can be fairly confident that you haven't introduced new bugs because the requirements as you understand them have been written into the system with your suite of unit tests.
So you guys are both web developers, and over the last 5 to 10 years, the complexity of modern full stack web applications has just went up several levels. How has this affected how unit testing is done?
I'd say it's definitely made some things easier, and it's made some things much harder. So specifically, we work with C#, .NET, and then some JavaScript framework. JavaScript, everything as far as testing goes, I believe is getting easier. Even in like Angular, where I'm doing TypeScript, and there's some limitations there. The testing is generally getting easier. The tools are getting better. And just from a raw point of the code that you have to write to be able to test with the new class syntax, that's actually getting a lot easier too. In C#, with the .NET Core framework, they have added interfaces for a bunch of things, which being able to abstract dependencies is like the number one thing that you need to be able to do in order to write a test for something. So that helps. However, some of those interfaces aren't abstracted very well. So even though they're there, you still have to, if you want to test around that thing, you still have to create your own interface as an abstraction, which makes things a little bit harder. And there's some other libraries that make testing kind of difficult because they don't follow patterns that allow you to abstract properly. On the whole, though, I think it's getting easier.
So have there been any innovations in unit testing that have really helped out, or has it just been a nice, slow, incremental, ease into, or making it easier to write unit tests?
For me, the most impactful things that have happened is the ability to watch your tests. So, and this is now in all the platforms. So the first time that I figured out how to do that, it was with a plugin for Visual Studio called InCrunch, and it will basically, anytime you stop typing, it will recompile your code and rerun your tests for you, which is amazing.
Yeah,
I can't
That's
imagine. I still use it. I can't imagine even with the way ReSharper handles that same concept and the way that Visual Studio Ultimate handles that same concept. I still much prefer InCrunch because the other two both require that you save the file, whereas InCrunch just runs. All I have to do is stop typing. Mm-hmm. The same thing is now available using the watch capability in .NET Core, and most of the JavaScript frameworks for testing now have some form of watch that is available. So I live recompile all of my code, and I will be running the application, running the tests, and coding at the same time, and all I have to do is stop typing, potentially save the file, and my application refreshes, my tests rerun, and I get instant feedback as to whether the code that I just wrote works or doesn't work. It's pretty amazing nowadays.
That is pretty awesome. And then speaking of tools, like one thing that I was thinking of, because I was huge into unit testing back in like 2010, and I couldn't remember the name of what it was, but have you guys ever heard of Pecs and Moles?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So I was pretty obsessed back in the day, and Pecs, I believe, was the tool that you could kind of like that voting example I gave. Visual Studio, this add-in would actually write the test for you. And if it said, hey, I want to add a vote, and what it would do is it would say, I'm going to add in like int.min. I'm going to do like -1. I'm going to do 0. I'm going to do 1. I'm going to do, some other value. And it would write all of those tests for you. Basically, every like sort of intrinsic edge case that exists in coding, it would automatically create the unit test for you. I can't really tell if that is like sort of still exists. It says that it was integrated into IntelliTest. So I don't know if that still exists. I don't know. Like, what do you guys think of the automated unit testing, and are there any tools around that you use today?
So I don't know. It's the last version of Pecs and Moles that I saw was incompatible with the latest versions of Visual Studio. That type of testing is called mutation testing. In the .NET and JavaScript areas, I don't think I've really seen too much of that. I was pretty excited when Pecs and Moles came out, and then they just kind of fell to the wayside.
Right.
But in like Ruby, they have I think it's Hide or maybe Jekyll as a mutation library that will mutate your code.
Okay.
It basically like flips one input, or it might even change. One of them, I think, actually changes your code just a little bit and kind of does the reverse of Pecs and Moles, where it changes your code and sees if it affects the tests, just to get a good coverage. And it'll let you know, hey, this line apparently isn't tested because we changed it and nothing happened. I really would like to see more of those kinds of tools, but so far I haven't seen those in C# and JavaScript outside of that one instance, which doesn't. To me, as far as I know, it's not still supported.
Yeah, because I think even if it doesn't write a test for you, like doesn't it seem logical that like your IDE, like if you write a method and you can take in a couple values, that it would do some kind of analysis and say, hey buddy, you're taking an int in, and if somebody passes in -1, it will throw an exception. Like it seems like that should just be inherent functionality, and I'm kind of surprised that doesn't exist already. Like you should be able to do that basic sort of runtime analysis with a couple different things and just give you a heads up that, hey, your code kind of sucks. Like, if somebody doesn't put in the perfect value, it's going to crash.
It's going to be the next VS Code plugin. It'll just analyze your code and then give you a Giphy with a meme in it.
Perfect.
Sad name that pops up on screen.
Okay. I'm just thinking it seems like there could be even, further, a lot of innovation in this space, just doing analysis through automated testing.
Yeah. With all the improvements in Visual Studio 2017 with ReSharper, I mean, I work until all the squiggles are gone from the right-hand side of my editor window. So, I'm always looking to improve the code and do whatever my editor tells me to do.
Which makes me kind of think, there's a time where we can just get sucked down into testing everything and make sure that there's 100% code coverage and whatnot. But when is that too much? And when should we just kind of let some things be user reported and let the users do the testing of our software?
Yeah, that's where I want to make sure that the testing that I'm doing is valuable. I was working with a large credit card firm, and they had a mandate that all code had to have 80% test coverage. And I was coming in on a legacy application and trying to bring that up to speed, and went to my manager and said, most of this code was written without testability in mind. I can wrap it in and make it testable, or I would have to modify the code. And he said, well, a lot of this is in production. We can't modify the code, but we need to get the coverage up. I said, okay, I can write tests around this. I can get the coverage up, but they'll be wholly meaningless tests. He said, well, we got to do what we got to do. So, sometimes you got to bite that bullet just for the corporate bureaucracy. But, when I'm working, I really want to make sure what I'm doing is valuable. I want to make sure that I'm testing the business requirements, not whether or not, an int is an int or whatever the case may be.
So, I have like maybe a real life example where maybe just doing it for that sake might have a good benefit of just having somebody go through the eyes of that legacy code. I think a couple of days ago, there was Twitter had announced that there's passwords being logged in plain text on their servers. They said they don't think anybody got them. But, I would think if I were a Twitter engineer and I was just, quote, backfilling unit tests for the sake of doing it, I might see a console.log password. And I might want to think twice about like, hey, why are we logging all these passwords to this text file? Might that be a good reason to do that, just to sniff out stuff like that?
That might be a happy accident, but I'm not sure. If we can do that without mandating that we have to hit some threshold, then I'd be all for it.
I'm all for the Boy Scout rule. So each time you're in a file or each time you open some code, make the code a little bit better. If it doesn't have tests, see what tests you can write, and maybe not write all of them, but write something. But the kind of test that John was talking about was literally call a method, do whatever you have to do to make it not blow up, and then move on to the next method. No assertions, no anything. Just it's ran as part of a unit test. So he probably wouldn't have been looking at the output to the console.
So if you're not asserting anything, is that even helping your coverage?
It counts.
It does count. Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that.
Well, I mean, it is executing.
It's executing the code.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. The tests run, and then every line that is used by the tests is what's counted as in the code coverage. So you don't even have to assert, which is why the it exists test work, because there's actually no assertion there. You're just var a equals new class. You could assert that A is not null if you wanted to, but you really don't have to. And it'll count it as being covered.
Okay. And then I did want to ask too, like we have a lot of, new developers obviously every day entering into our profession. And I was just curious if that's pushing the percentage of people that are unit testing, like in a positive direction, or is it negative? Because it's sort of a losing battle, right? Like we keep training people to do unit testing, but every 2 years, if our trade doubles in size and all the new people are not doing unit testing, then obviously it becomes a lower and lower percentage. So I don't know if you guys have any feel for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, the companies, so the code schools and that kind of thing, they are probably generating the better developers. I don't think the colleges are really giving the developers the knowledge that they need at this point. If you're going into something where you need to know big O notation, then maybe. But as far as just general programming, 90% of the stuff, I'm making this up, is line of business applications, and you don't need big O notation to do CRUD. But what you do need to do is know for loops, if statements, variable declarations, object-oriented structure, those kinds of things. And I don't think college is really teaching that. So unfortunately, the college individuals, I think, are really behind. The code school individuals, they're only teaching them what the companies tell them they want. And the companies generally don't care about testing. They care about someone who can write code fast. Yeah. So I do feel like we're kind of falling behind on that one, and it kind of saddens me a little bit.
Yeah, I was working with a consultant group locally here, and was trying to introduce TDD to my team, and was initially told that I could have 3 days to train up the team. Then it dropped down to 1 day. Then it dropped down to about an hour, and really just kind of brushed the surface, or maybe it was an afternoon, but really just kind of brushed the surface. And during that training, it was revealed that they had tried to put unit testing in the contract with their clients, and they allowed their clients to veto that as a line item, that they didn't want to pay for it.
Yeah, it costs too much to make sure the code's correct.
It's funny. So I wanted to kind of finish what I was talking about, like in the beginning, right? So I was kind of talking along the same lines, like, hey, I want to put this unit testing in. So on the next project, I actually, I was a consultant after that, and I took a different approach. I did unit testing, and then afterward, I told the client, I said, hey, this took me less time, because I was big on using unit testing to actually save time. I figured out how to make it so that I could develop my code faster, because I wasn't sort of going back and battling all of the first features. I had feature B and then it breaks feature A. So I was actually able to save time. So I went back after the fact then, and I would tell them, hey, by the way, this got done faster thanks to unit testing. And now you have these. If anybody else works on this code base, it's a lot safer to work on this code base. And I actually never had any pushback on that.
Yeah, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Well, it wasn't even forgiveness, though. It was really like asking to give them more.
Yeah.
I mean, I that's the way that I looked at it. I really don't think that I had any reason to ask for forgiveness. Like I said, I literally made the code faster, and I actually have numerous examples of where I was able to do that. Like I built, one of them was like a complex calendar system for an airline, and I had to actually like rebuild some of these like base constructs, like recurring events, and I need this to be like every third Saturday and like that type of thing. And whenever you're building a system like that, just like my other example where you're converting that string into that time, like you can imagine, it's so much faster because your cycle for writing your code, validating the code works, and then adding another feature is so much faster. So I could all, that's why I'm so passionate about the actual developer test versus the business tests, because I would use it as a tool to get my code done faster, and my code would be better because of it.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. Been working on my current project with another developer, and we're similarly skilled. And I came on the project after he had already started and built up a fairly significant code base. And so I started in, and he had not been doing testing, so I started in on new features and building out additional functionality in the system. And he said, what you've been able to accomplish in weeks would have taken me many months. I said, well, really, this is just how I work. And I work quickly, but I work very consistently and safely by starting with the tests. And I don't have to always go back and regression test manually the entire system, because I know I haven't broken anything along the way. If I have a failing test, I know that the last thing I did was what broke that test because I'm running the suite of tests the entire time.
Yeah. And I have a similar type approach. When I start a job at a new company, I don't even tell them about tests or anything like that. And then after a couple months, I tell them that I've only been working 40 hours a week, and that's how I operate, and I just do TDD. And they get kind of wide-eyed because they thought I was doing 60 or 80 hours a week.
Yeah, that's pretty dramatic. But the one thing that I'm wondering, though, is I've heard a few people specifically talk about unit testing is really hard when you're refactoring, because you're moving classes around to new namespaces, or you're moving methods between classes, and now the tests no longer match up because there's nothing there where a class or a method used to be. So how do you handle refactoring and not doubling your work, having to move everything around twice with the original code and the unit test code?
So
that comes down to go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would point to two items there. That first, they probably have tied their test too closely to the implementation, and they're not writing their tests in a way that's testing the behavior of the system. So when you're refactoring like that, you're probably not wanting to change the behavior of the system. But if you do find the need to change the behavior, then I would start by modifying the tests. And then once you change the test to the new expected behavior, then you know what line is breaking, you know where the failure is. You can go in and address that a little bit more easily and a little more cleanly.
Cool. And so I noticed that your book, it has 5-star. It's all 5-star reviews on Amazon, which is congratulations. That's pretty awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover that we may have missed? I mean, obviously, the book, like 90% of the book, but I mean, anything you want to mention on the show?
Well, we also have a podcast on the Six Figure Developer, and okay. We write a blog at sixfiguredev.com and tweet from that account as well.
Very cool.
And we also run the stpete.net meetup in St. Petersburg, Florida. So if you or any of your listeners ever find yourself down this way, we'd love to have you.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so let's move on to the Azure Pick of the Week. What do you have, Carl?
I have a bunch of Azure Cosmos DB query cheat sheets. Mm-hmm. And what's really cool about these is because Cosmos DB is multimodal, there is a cheat sheet for every mode. So you have your Mongo API, your table API, your Gremlin Graph API, and your SQL API cheat sheets. So there's 4 cheat sheets in one that you can shuffle out depending upon which mode that you're interacting it with. And of course, because it's always cool, is you can always on the fly switch between any one of those on the same Cosmos database.
Very cool, very cool. And then I have the dev tip of the week, which is around hiding .js.map files in Visual Studio Code. What made me think of this was whenever you write a spec in JavaScript, you do this. A lot of people call them like .spec.js. So you definitely don't want to hide those. But if you have something like TypeScript, so you have a TS file, what you want to do is you want to hide the automatically generated JS files. So what's really cool is in VS Code, you can tell it that if there is a TS file that exists, and there's a corresponding JS file with the same name, to hide that JS file. And what's cool about it is if let's say you deleted that TS file, then the JS file will all of a sudden appear out of nowhere, which is pretty cool because it actually is there. But it's hidden because it's just a generated file. So I have a link in the show notes to that. But basically, what you end up doing is you have a file exclusion in VS Code, and then you just have a where or a when parameter on there that says when $basename.ts. So basically, when that file exists, then hide that type of file. So you can go check that out. We'll have that in the show notes. And I don't know if I have cards here. I think they might be packed. Give me 1 second. There's a game that we play on this show, but we might have to skip it this week. Oh no, I see some in the bottom of the box here. So let me dig these out. I will shuffle them. And normally I'd have you guys pick a number between 1 and 4, but we all have almost extinguished every number, so I'm just going to pick one for you guys. So I'll just give you guys one question you guys can each answer here. Okay, this doesn't make any sense. This is talking about your schoolmates. Hold on. Oh, here we go. Would you rather leave a slime trail everywhere you walk like a snail, or always leave a trail of smoke like an old car? So Clayton and John, which one did you pick?
I think I'd prefer to leave a slime trail.
Yeah.
Makes me feel like when I was a kid, or is it Pigpen from the Peanuts?
Yeah. Well, that would be like the smoke then.
Well, but he was really it was smoke, but it was really just dirt.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Did you want to answer?
No, I'll take a different one.
You're going to take a different one? Okay, here we go. Would you rather have an extra hand where one of your feet is, or have an extra eye where one of your hands is?
Oh, I as a developer, I'd have to go with an extra hand. I mean, that could have a hand on the mouse and 2 on the keyboard.
Wow. Actually, that would be way more efficient, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but then you'd have to put your leg up on the desk.
Or you put your mouse down by your foot.
Oh, that'd actually be
even
pretty
better.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be pretty awesome.
Yeah, but I'll be leaving a trail of slime on the floor though. And then
Yeah, I know. Meanwhile,
that'll help the mouse glide.
yeah. Meanwhile, he's there. 3 hands.
Yeah, I'll take monkey feet for 3, Alex.
Okay. Carl, would you rather eat a steak that has been left on a busy road for an hour, or drink a glass of juice that has been slowly poured through the wig of a sweaty fat woman with dandruff?
I'm going to take the steak on a road.
These questions, I don't know what year what year did this come out here? These things, this is just ridiculous. Originally, it's from Zombocom Entertainment LLC. Originally copyright 1998.
Fantastic.
Did you say Zombocom?
No. You can do anything at Zombocom. No, this is Zobmondo was the name. You can do a little bit of research on. Anyway, I think you guys kind of said where we can find you. Well, actually, where can we find you guys individually? You guys on Twitter?
yes, you can find me, John, on Twitter at Matsu Bonsai.
Okay. And Clayton?
And yeah, mine is pretty simple. It's Clayton Hunt _104 on Twitter.
Okay, man, the first 103 were taken, huh?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's actually a leftover from Hotmail.
Oh, that's
back
funny.
in the day, back in 1999.
That's awesome. And Carl, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Carl Schweitzer.
And you can find me at twitter.com/ytechie. So guys, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about unit testing. This was really awesome, talking about, something that I know has been around for a long time, but it was great catching up on like what the latest thinking and tools are.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yep. Thank you.